Hi everyone, my name is JR Cormex, and this is the first video that I wanted to talk about. Um, Obviously, with the advent of AI, with ChatGPT and everything else going on, um, a lot of people have been discussing what's the point of an education. What is the point of learning? What is it? What is the actual use of it? Why would I have to learn anything? Why have to learn from various different subjects if I have AI to do everything for me? And actually, kind of what's put me onto doing this video at this moment just now was this recent video from Henderson, which I'll show here in 1 second. This video just came out last week. Let's see, 6 days ago. And I wanted to have a better script for this. I was writing one kind of, but decided to change it all entirely to kind of go into more of what his catalyst for this video was. This is a good video. He talks a lot about why people might be using AI, specifically professors or students. And he goes a lot into incentives. So please view it. I'll have it in the notes below. But this was the kind of catalyst of this, is that why is AI in schooling and how are people using it? And again, like I already said, the incentives is the structure that he goes into. He goes into why a student you want to use AI if they just need a credential to get a job. He talks about why a professor would want to use AI, and that's just about putting out enough publications such that they can get tenure. And then it goes into a lot of better detail in there. But this was kind of the cause of me making this video and why this is very rough. This is very poor. I don't really care. I wanted to get my ideas out there. And I want to discuss a little bit more on that. There was more to how he was talking about just the incentives, but I want to talk about what the incentive was for learning in general. And I have some more notes and articles of that I'd be going over, but this is a rough outline that I'm going to be going over. No real script. I'm just going to be kind of talking. And so, as he discussed in the video, we talked about professors using ChatGPT to grade or teach. There's even another post on Reddit just today of a teacher complaining about AI, complaining about some teachers that they know, some of their colleagues, not only using AI to create the quiz or worksheet for the students to work on, but also stating to the students to use it to answer the questions. Apparently from their experience, not only did this teacher say, yeah, I just used AI, so go ahead and use AI to answer the questions. And that obviously is very dangerous. And so not going to talk about that quite yet, but wanted to bring up these various little things that happened recently and why I wanted to finally make this video. And he also discussed about why students want to use AI besides just get a job. And if they are going to be using AI, what would they be doing in the meantime? And it would be just about freeing up their time or to, go do something in which they can actually make money. Instead of just, learning something that they believe they don't need to know. Again, if they have like arbitrary classes or people that might believe arbitrary classes is just to get a credential and get a job. Since most of the time people are looking at just a degree and not looking at necessarily the courses that you might have taken. So if it's like an English class or maybe history or whatnot. We just discussed a bit about what are the skills you would develop not using AI. You would actually have to think critically. You'd have to struggle. And those are the points of where you'd actually learn. But there's been no incentive for that. Again, as he talks about in this video, I'm just going to have his face up there for a bit while I discuss a little bit on the points of his video. But again, there's other skills that you do learn having conflict with people. The same as any muscle, as is said for decades before I was even born. Your brain is a muscle, everything is a muscle. And so if you don't use it, or, only when you actually hit those points of struggle, that's where you actually have growth. A very old quote from Michael Jordan for basketball is that he wouldn't start counting certain reps until he started feeling tired or he started feeling sore. That's when he'd actually start counting. Similar thing here, not to get into any other sports or misattributed quotes, but that's, again, the gist of it. He also discussed a few other books that I've read before, such as Brian Kaplan's The Case Against Education, or Ivan Illich's Deschooling Society, which was before even Brian Kaplan, about the issues with schooling as this huge monolith. They were very much against schooling. They believe it was a waste of time unless you're going to somehow use those skills in the future, and I very much disagree. But again, watch this video. It is really good. You can watch it, 2x speed, or join his book club. He has a lot of good books that he reads. But that's kind of what I just wanted to show that here for a second as I discuss other points. So again, first video, so I'm just trying to get ideas out there that have been bugging me for a long time. And so right now you're just going to be looking at my dumb face, but I might be looking over at my little outline. And so I want to discuss more about what was the point of education to begin with. One of the things that the current head of the Department of Education has even said that it's fine to dismantle it because there wasn't a constitutional amendment to education. And this still isn't, obviously. There hasn't been ever. It was more of kind of a push. And so a lot of times in the past, and before the 1800s and the first, settling of this country as it is now, schooling was just put together by materials from, the local communities, pretty much, homeschooling, but not just homeschooling. Other communities would pull the resources together. Not every parent could be teaching their kids all day. Obviously, they could be teaching them how to grow food on the farm or do other various tasks. But there's also a little bit more education on top of that, that they would have one person is kind of teach. And so because it was mostly just community based and it was from the very beginning of the settlers, and settlers being mostly Protestant, a lot of the schooling was based off just getting the students to be able to learn from the Protestant Bible. So a lot of the reading practice that they would do would be from the Bible. That's what they would just memorize. They learn letters, learn words. And that was the basis. They wanted to have a basis of education of the Bible and, doing things for your community, whatever that may be. So the biggest part of it was that schools were just more of a place to be of service to your community, whether it's service to actually a community of actually raising livestock or planting crops or harvesting crops or whatever. It was also about what you're doing for the community, also through church. So obviously through the Protestant church. So it was all about service. And it wasn't until after independence that there was even a larger push towards education. After independence was achieved for the United States, they decided that this was the way to teach the new way of the world. There's a brand new country, the founders were like, okay, we have this new country. How are we going to bring people together after cutting ourselves off from this culture of Britain? So how would you do that? You do that through a unified schooling system. And so they wanted schools to take place of teaching this new independence. They wanted to create a unified culture. They wanted to create a new national history. Obviously put in a bit of lore of the founders saying, various things like, I could never tell a lie, and all of those little things. They're pretty much, could be slightly accurate, but also just pretty much fables, to create a backbone of history that everybody can have one single culture. And they wanted to use the education to preserve the freedom that was just achieved. That if you finally win your freedom, everybody goes back to their ways without having any sort of connection to the entire country. Obviously, that could fracture people bit by bit. So Jefferson had this big idea of, yes, teaching people and getting a better education, but it was more about what he would say is like raking geniuses from their rubbish. So it wasn't necessarily about getting everybody to one single plane of intelligence. It was about how do we develop the new crop of political leaders in the future. And so this was kind of the way of doing that. Obviously, slaves weren't allowed to learn, even though they still would learn and teach each other and learn how to read. But they risked their lives in doing so, of course. But even back then, with a push for a bigger education or a better education, a lot of the the elites and politicians still would scoff at the idea of a farmer learning about philosophy or anything that he wouldn't need to run his farm or to build anything on the farm. So it was a slight beginnings of, we do need to kind of put out education out there, but only insofar as developing new politicians. So it was still expensive. It still wasn't necessarily free, but it was an idea. Jefferson did have the very beginning of the idea of a more unified and available education. And again, the quote that Thomas Jefferson, everyone should be Thomas Jefferson, and he may or may not have said, If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. So you can't be ignorant and free. You have to know about the country. You have to know about the rights. You have to know what's going on, or else you're not free. You're just going to be doing what someone else tells you. And so it wasn't until years later that a gentleman named Horace Mann actually pushed for more equal schooling. He hated the inequity that were in schools. Obviously, there's a big inequity between poor and rich affordability of schools since it wasn't publicly funded. So he pushed to make public schools so good that everyone wanted to attend, even those in private schools, they didn't want to come to public schools. So that was his big push. I'm not going to go into every single piece of history, but obviously many people already know about him. But it's starting there again of like each little iteration is of how do we get education to everybody in the country and to be of service in politics or in the community in some way. So in around 1840, that's when we start having the first kind of larger influx of immigrants. We had a large, obviously on the East Coast and pretty much any time anyone immigrate. We had a large influx of Irish Catholic immigrants. And so they were often poor and of course they desired education. So they were allowed to the schools, but they found that the education, well, we know it was free. It was getting freer at the time, but it was mostly Protestant education. Because again, the history had been that any sort of local community school had been based off of the Protestant Bible. And not only that, but because it was Protestant and it was the 1800s, a lot of it was still very, I guess I would just say racist towards Irish firstly, and also pretty much just textbooks were full of slander for Catholicism. You can also look up that. I'm not going to go into exactly what those details were. So the Catholics started a push for having this education start to be developed for their way of thinking. They were the first kind of foray into, okay, well, if the Protestants can have their own specific schooling, then we demand public funds for our kind of schooling. We want our students and our kids to learn about Catholic, the Bible, and have an education based on Catholicism. So there's a lot of propaganda then as well of having education be what happens. Oh, well, if we give Catholics special money, then we have schools based on any other different kind of religion or race or whatever. Just you have public funds going into these different kinds of schools all over the place. So that was kind of the beginning of that, but still based on the idea of how do you have everyone have education? How is it free? How is it funded? And again, and I'm gonna disagree with this later, but this education has been beginning from a place of religion being bifurcated. So that will set up issues later. But then even after that big push, it started happening even more so during Western settling, when people started actually to venture west. And as that happened, one of the biggest things that started to be the main focal point of getting settlers to come and settle your town, and actually build up your town so it doesn't become just like a fledgling little hodgepodge of people that eventually dies down. How do you actually make a settlement in a town that builds and grows and sustains itself for decades and centuries to come? You have to provide good services as a town. That's the basis of it. We can even see that now with rural areas, having younger people leave. And we can also get into that later. But as they knew at the time, they needed good schools, they needed good services in order to get people enticed to stay in your community and grow it, and develop economic activity or any activity. And so schools were one of those offerings. And they focused on hiring women because they were cheaper and good with kids. Obviously, we know about the wage disparities, so I don't need to go into that. But there was a focus on getting women into the schools to not only teach the kids, obviously, but there was always has been the inkling of they could also watch and take care of the kids as if they were another motherly figure. And so there are the famous McGuffrey books. They were used to teach literacy and basis of morality. Those are kind of the fables that we know. Also, how do you have a basis of morality that is independent of religion, or at least attempting to maybe kind of be or have a guise of it? That was what those books were. But again, it was women that were, very much enticed or encouraged to learn in college and then head west and venture out away from the home, which is obviously very different even at the time from what women were expected to be doing. And so with that push, it was a way for, women to get money. But again, through education, and kind of unimportant for this talk, but there are little points here and there that each one could be talked about at length. But that's not necessarily what I'm going to be doing here. So then later on with the Morrill Act of 1862, also known as the Land Grant College Act, that was from Lincoln, and it provided the first federal lands to establish colleges focused on agriculture and mechanical arts. This act, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln, as I said, aimed to make higher education more accessible, particularly to those in rural areas. So it was a lot of Western colleges were established at this point, and this was even higher than just like the base college that the women that were settling west would have been teaching. These were colleges, again, that were trying to be used as a way to not only entice people to move to those areas, but then also to learn new skills to develop the country even further and have a better foothold into the United States as it is today. So from that, I wanted to go into a bit of what the point of college is historically. And so the primary purpose at the time, like colleges have been around for a long time, even before, the settling of this country and all the things I just discussed for primary education. But again, even at that time, the primary purpose of college was to train clergy, again, religious leaders or political leaders, for not only the colonies, but even any other college in the world. And you can see that also playing out, as I already described, in primary education, where the main purpose of the first start of it was to teach about their Bible, their way of thinking, and obviously to teach how to read and write, but the literacy was only used insofar as you could read the Bible and then follow it and go on your merry way. And so one of the famous quotes is from Harvard when it was founded in 1636. And they were founded to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, and obviously to train ministers. And Yale had the same thing years later. And so all of those are very, the famous ones that are still prestigious, as some people might still define what prestigious means, was again based off morality and religious formation and developing leaders. And it wasn't until later on that it was more specifically that the primary purpose of education was to train democratic leaders, and not necessarily democratic as we might call the parties today, but as leaders of the new republic that was being developed. And at that time, it started to shift from pure religious, but also to a civic and moral mission about emphasizing character and virtue in and of itself, rather than being solely based on a religion. Obviously, with a lot of these, it's kind of hard to bifurcate religion and morality, being that the country was at least around Protestantism, but that doesn't mean it has to stay that way or is going to be that way or will ever be that way again. Because I obviously agree with separation of church and state. But again, we're mixing into a lot of things. That's because education is everything. And so at that time is when it starts to be a little bit of development of the universities versus colleges connection. Universities are made up of several smaller colleges that specialize in different bits. But that's still not too much of an issue at this time. It's not really too much of their importance. It was more of a slightly bit into specialization. Even though at this time it was still, you have to be a jack of all trades to be a political leader or civic leader. You still have to know, a lot of different things, because it's pretty insane to get information. And so then in the 19th century, we started having those changes and influences, obviously, as with the acts I described before from Abraham Lincoln. It introduced those practical studies that were still rooted in civic and moral purposes. So still based on how can a person be of service to the community, and not how can a person just do what they're interested in, or develop themselves just for themselves. It was more, what can I do for being service. And so the purpose was starting to shift maybe about this time. Instead of just moral and civic formation, it was a slight emergence of research and professional training. We started to see the creation of specific graduate and professional schools, such as law, medicine, and engineering. And that's, again, when we see a bigger rise of a university alongside older ideas of college. So again, a coagulation of these different colleges to make a whole university, and then each college is, again, specializing. So then once we get into 1900s, it starts to be more a larger blend of liberal arts and professionalization. So colleges were framed as a place for, character formation, leadership, civic responsibility for very elite groups still. And universities started to add this research to service society as part of their mission. They instead of just seeing themselves as an elite, think tank at the time, they started to say that, being as a university, not just training these people to go out and be of service, but everybody, this university as itself can promote and push different ideas based off academic rigor. And so they were still very selective and socially elite. Mass attendance and careerism were not yet dominant at this time. Obviously, you could say from 1900s to 1940s. As you can see, it's from only the First World War is the only one that had happened during this time. But it still wasn't seen as anything besides just very select few would even go to college. So biggest catalyst, obviously, where college at least started to really take off is after World War II with the GI Bill of 1944. It started to give, literally just give education to more of the populace, obviously just to, white men that were coming back from the war. Not only, college, but a home and everything. So pretty much just handed everything. But it starts to be more of a middle class method of achieving greater, financial success and stability. And then from after that, it was mostly the beginning of the Cold War where there was a really big shift into, the harder sciences of, actual, biology and, chemistry and engineering, and like every single piece of engineering, building out, large rockets, building out highways, building out just highways to basically be able to connect every single military base, but that's neither here nor there. But again, building out very specific hard sciences that don't necessarily have any sort of moral or religious twist to them, at least at the time. It was more of a what is a hard science, in fact. And you can argue that certain bits of science do have a morality to them. Don't really have to discuss how we hired a bunch of Nazi scientists to do, and just to avoid going to jail and to advance medicine, but we won't have to discuss that here. So again, by 1960, it's pretty much where it is now, of that college was still part of moral and civic duty, but way more into professionalism, getting that credential to be a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor. That was obviously still very much pushed here to be very specialized. And I kind of stopped from this history right here in 1960, only in that we could get more into how during this time college started to be less seen by the government as a duty to its citizens and more of a fun house for the elite. And that is to say, when college students were put us in the Vietnam War, presidents hated that. And so they started to wonder, how can we get people to not be able to go to this college, not be able to afford it? And so they started to defund schools and just allow, public funding, public student loans to take over. And that's how you start to get, runaway student debt, is from not wanting to educate the populace, because if they get too educated, then they will protest things that they don't like. And, governments don't like that people are protesting these things. And so want to move on from there to go and actually talk about the Higher Education Act amendments of 1972 under Nixon. They create basic Pell Grants and then expanded student loans that were backed by the federal government. But with these Pell Grants and with the Student Loan Act, that just allowed the government to start to not fund schools. Like, oh, well, we have, well, students want this so bad, they can go and pay for it themselves. Like these, if they're going to get better jobs, if they're going to go study something, and then why should the government have to pay for this? And you can argue that it's the public that's paying for it, even though I follow modern monetary theory, which states if the government wants to pay for something, it can, as long as the good actually exists. College being one of those, and so this act and these Pell Grants just provided the government an out from giving the populace what it's been giving for decades. And so I don't want to go into the politics of it too much, even though education is entirely politics. But again, it's about this time that I believe Jared Henderson, the person I showed their YouTube video earlier, does go into a little bit more about how incentives quickly changed, and not as many details, but obviously you can go over all the details, and I'll have some more in the notes. But with all of that, I still wanted to get into just a bit of a partial conclusion and partial just rambling that I've been doing. And that is to say that there's still a duty to learn, even with any AI coming into existence. Everybody still has a duty to learn, even selfishly for themselves. You don't want to take any AI as truth, like pretty much ever. It can still be very much manipulated. You've seen most of this manipulation through Grok AI, where there was a period where you ask it any question and it would just answer with the white genocide in South Africa. And so it's like, if every question can be manipulated so easily and so quickly, that doesn't mean anything else can't be manipulated even more quickly. There'll still be some of this from bots in the past, in the early 2000s, or from the advent of the internet. You'd have a bunch of bots or people just come and spam propaganda during elections or during certain stories that are posted online. And AI just makes that much easier for someone to do, for some sort of bad actor to want to come in and flood something with something that is fake or just a lie. And as to cherry pick off of what Jared Henderson said about professors publishing AI only research to have more publications pushed forward so they can get tenure. That can happen also with AI. You can use AI to flood some sort of public science journal with a bunch of stories, and if all these AIs are trained off of what they believe is good or factual information, such as these science journals, then there's no reason that the questions that you get back will just be flooded from a bunch of those stories. And so then the question you get back is just from other AI that has been manipulated and warped to be lies. And so you think that you have something that was based off something that a professor did through various very strong academic rigor, but it's just going to be AIs and a lie. So you can't even trust that in itself. You can't just trust what AI gives you, and you can't even necessarily trust what a science paper gives you. You have to go into the details. And that would, and I would branch off from there to say that's why you need certain specific trusted public figures that have a basis of morality at always 100% of the time, or else, I won't get into that too much, but that's why you have to have some people that you can trust in these academic spaces, because you can't know everything. You can't learn everything. You're not supposed to have to. But also when you go through those journals and figure out what is right, what's wrong, it develops that critical thinking muscle. It allows you to say, okay, well, I've read this over here and I read this piece over here. How can I tell either one is right or wrong? And that's when you dig into the next layer of who were their sources. Okay. And then what from their sources, what was their data? And if their data could be hard data, could be actual numbers, but it could be just actually, interviews with people. Not everything can be put into a data, a piece of, a numerical figure. It has to be sometimes through just, text. And even though some people try to put numerical values to text to analyze sentiment, you still have to read it yourself, because one way you perceive a word could be very different from the way somebody who's creating these AIs perceives a word, no matter what they do. Again, these are human interactions that you have to be building. And the other thing is to build ideas for yourself. AI, if it's just telling you some data, it's still going to have some sort of spin from whoever posted that data. You have to build ideas for yourself. You can have politicians that you like. You can have online personalities that you like, but you can't always take what they say as fact. There's plenty of podcasts and streamers that I've watched, and I know they've been wrong, and they have been. And not only wrong just in their opinion, but wrong in getting the data incorrect from whatever news story that they're talking about, which is fine. They're people too. They're just developing a product of reasonable analysis on a news story. But you still have to be able to dig into it yourself. You can't just accept you can't accept everything that someone has given you. You have to push back on some things or read at least some of it. You can't just blindly say, yep, this person said this, I'm just going to follow it. You have to do some sort of digging on even your most favorite person. You have to do something for yourself. As I described, bots can flood the training data of AI. AI itself can be not even flooded by bots. It can be, altered by the person who makes it. And so you can't just take what AI says ever. You have to understand, at least you have to have some sort of understanding of what you're asking it first to know when it's lying to you, or not lying, or just wrong. Because again, the AI doesn't know anything. It is just regurgitating a mix of what a bunch of people have put online for free. It took everything that everyone's put online ever for free, that through the individual's own hard work, that they took the time to study, analyze, put some code to read something on Stack Overflow and say, oh, here's how I got through this problem. Through years and years and years, AI just, sucked all that up and is spitting it back to you. It has no basis of, it has some partial basis of what is a good answer and what is a bad answer, but it's still not necessarily trying to give you a good answer. It's trying to give you make you a happy answer. So you still have to understand what you're going to ask it firstly, and then understand what is a good enough answer or a poor answer. Again, you have to critically think for yourself. And so really the final conclusion I have of this is that you have to learn in spite of AI. So even if you could ask AI to give you a summary of the top 5 battles of World War II, whatever top 5 even means, whatever metric it's going to think is top 5. You have to analyze why those battles mattered. You have to analyze why the generals, picked those battles. If you want to understand how Coca-Cola came to be what it is, you can't just say, give me the top 5 things. You can't put everything into a list. You have to analyze every single bit that went into that company yourself. And you also have to analyze the politics of the time, what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. And there are plenty of free resources you can still use to learn. There's a local library. You can find a bunch of stuff online still, even with AI. You can learn them yourself. You can learn even the back ends of some of these. Some of these are AI tools are made freely available. You can figure out what you can try and dig into why it's doing certain things, or even just learn the code yourself. You can start from the basics. There's plenty of books on it. Because even just learning those basics of how a certain AI is developed can start to tell you, okay, so if I ask it this question, it's going to be based off this really old model, perhaps. So I know why it gave me this as an answer instead of something else. It would take a long time to get there to fully understand its skeleton even. But at least you understand again that these AI tools, even the ones today, and even the ones a year from now, they don't know anything. They don't know anything. They're what people have put into them and then put various measures of quality, whatever those measures are, onto them. So again, they're large language models. They are text predictors. They are not, again, they don't know anything, and they never will know anything. They're just predictors. So you still need to learn in spite of that. You have to learn in order to think for yourself in a democracy. You have to learn to be, in order to be a good enough citizen, even again, in spite of the government not providing proper resources, you have to continue to learn. You have to, if you don't continue to learn and just use AI for everything, then you're literally giving your job away. If you only want to go and learn to get a job, but there's more reasons to learn than having a job. There's more reasons to learn than just trying to survive to the next day. It's to, again, think about even in the past where even, slaves at the time in this country and everywhere learned in spite of obstacles, even at risk of death. And I have various resources on more of these that obviously better writers put together and better videos and whatnot. And I'll put it in the description notes. But that all I had to say is that do not use AI if in lieu of learning. Like if you learn the thing and you still go and use AI, that's fine. But if you go and learn the code yourself, if you go and read the book yourself, and then you could read the book and focus on it and create a summary, ask AI to do a summary. You can maybe compare those. You can maybe use AI to find certain give me sources for this thing or articles. You could try that and try and find articles. But again, how does it grade the articles? Is it going to grade articles that it's allowed to buy? So for example, I believe it was ChatGPT who just gave, or actually I think it was Amazon, or who was it? Doesn't matter. But New York Times got a small sum of $20 million to allow their news articles to be fully scraped. So that AI, if it's giving $20 million to New York Times, are those resources going to be put at the top of the sources that it asks for? And I think most people would also understand now that there are various problems with New York Times, including when they decided to not endorse Zoran Mamdani, and people have issues with that as well. So learn in spite of all the obstacles ahead of you. I know it's easier for me to say and here, just, sitting here just talking, but, and I don't know everybody's, circumstance, but you have to learn, if only to preserve the democracy. You cannot give over all your thinking to an AI, to a company that doesn't necessarily even care about you. So that's all I wanted to say. I'd have better scripts in the future, but this is the first step that I'm trying to do. This is probably going to be a very poor video. I don't care. I wanted to get these ideas out there. But yep, I will have probably more in the future, and I'll see you in the next one.